Here's an interesting one, and this is something I was talking about a few days ago when I actually talked about what Trump did. It was compared to Hitler back in, I do believe it's 33. And this is the famous Reichstag fire that happened. It was similar, fortunately not the same, but similar to what happened in Germany. I'm going to read this. This is from a German newspaper. Capitol Hill riots are Western democracies under attack. The images of Trump supporters storming Capitol Hill in Washington look eerily familiar to many Germans. Now, there is a heated debate about whether democracies are in danger on this side of the Atlantic, too. The scenes that unfolded on Capitol Hill on Wednesday reminded many Europeans of events in their own countries. In 2006, a far-right mob stormed the Hungarian parliament, for example, engaging in street battles with police that lasted for weeks. These events ultimately saw an increase in support for a right-wing populist Prime Minister, Viktor Orban. Some Germans felt reminded of the National Socialist riots of the 1920s and 1930s, but there were striking parallels with much more recent events. In August 2020, after the protest of so-called Querdenker, lateral thinker movement against the government's coronavirus restrictions, very similar, demonstrators stormed the steps of the Reichstag, Germany's parliament building. Several of them were brandishing flags from the country's imperial era and symbols of the extreme right. Police prevented the mob from entering the building, but events deeply shook Germany. Seditious words turned into violent deeds on the steps of the Reichstag and now on the Capitol, German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas said on Wednesday. Hatred and agitation endanger democracy. Lies endanger democracy. Violence endangers democracy. German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier warned his countrymen and women on Thursday. There are many parallels between the events in Washington and Berlin, says Miro Dietrich, a researcher who has been studying right-wing extremists on the internet for years. He says both the German Querdenker movement and the Trump supporters used online forums, messenger services, and social media platforms in order to plan their actions. Before the so-called storming of the Reichstag, and also before the storming of the U.S. Capitol, you could find clear signs online that this was about to happen, he says. The problem is that the security agencies didn't see that, Dietrich deplores. The alternative realities that are forming on the internet with people clearly calling for violence and organizing this, they're being ignored. Dietrich says the German and the U.S. authorities are also not strong enough in patrolling the digital space. But is democracy itself as vulnerable as the buildings that were breached in Budapest, Berlin, and now Washington, D.C.? Political scientist Daniel Zietblat has spent many years studying the breakdown of democracies in Europe, Latin America, and now his own country. The United States, he believes, is a democracy under threat worldwide. The U.S. is a pretty old democracy. It is a rich democracy. This should make it stable. And the fact that we are seeing the erosion of democracy in the U.S. should be a warning to other countries, says Zietblat, who together with Stephen Levitsky has written the best-selling book, How Democracies Die. Yep, that is a very popular book. I need to read it. Zietblat tells DW that the previously dominant majority in the U.S., white male Christians, perceives itself as being in decline, which is true. This is in part what is driving this, and the societal change is a commonality of all Western democracies. The level of polarization, however, is much higher in the United States than in most European countries, Zietblat says. Part of this has to do with the fact that we have a two-party system. So that is a zero-sum political battle. Coalition governments can take the hard edge off politics. It's probably right. Lessons learned. German political scientist Sebastian Bokow points out another crucial difference between Germany and the U.S. In the U.S., for 4 years, democracy has been repeatedly questioned by the president himself. In contrast, he says right-wing protesters in Berlin were supported by a very small radical minority in society. Bokow doesn't think that a degeneration into violence is on the horizon for all Western democracies. He draws on a study on authoritarianism conducted recently by researchers from Leipzig University. It showed that in Germany, satisfaction with democracy is stable, even rising, but there is nevertheless a small radicalizing section of society that rejects democracy. In 1933, German democracy failed as the Nazis exploited its weakness and managed to establish a totalitarian regime. That is why after World War II, West Germany established what it considered a resilient democracy, a system in place until today that limits freedom of speech and association in order to safeguard and protect the constitutional order. I think there's something to be learned for the U.S. from that German experience, Daniel Zblot says. The idea that democracy is not a machine that runs on its own, but that it has to be defended is a valuable lesson. The irony, of course, that Americans helped build German democracy. Fair enough. The Germans see it because they experienced it. When I said that what you saw was similar to Hitler, similar. I didn't say it was the same. I was giving you a parallel about how things can go wrong and how there has to be limits on everything. There is no such thing as total freedom anywhere. It just isn't. I know everybody wants to go into this cyberpunk idea of how the world should be built or how society should be ordered. It doesn't work that way. Never has. Everybody sits in their individual little pods on their little individual phones. The ideas that they spin out of their head will actually work in the real world until you have to start settling disputes among people. You cannot get 330 million people to agree. It's not going to happen. There has to be rules of the road. There has to be laws in place. There has to be limits set. If you don't set the limits, if you don't put laws in, you think you're going to get more chaos, but eventually chaos is going to turn into what you saw turn into Germany in the 1930s. Like they said, that the Nazis didn't just pop up out of nowhere. He said that was going on in the 20s. And basically, the Nazis were a throwback to the 19th century, when they had a strict totalitarian ordered society. That's how come the Hitler called himself the Third Reich. He wanted to dump democracy. He wanted the Führer, or the leader, to go back to an authoritarian society. Donald Trump wanted to do the same thing. Just like Adolf exploited the weaknesses in German democracy, the fledgling German democracy, Trump tried to exploit the same thing. Because you have a crisis because of COVID, you have a crisis, people are upset, people are disgruntled, you tried to exploit that. The thing is that they weren't built for that life. They weren't ready for this. What if after his second 4 years, he didn't want to leave and people were ready for it? There's got to be limits on everything. You don't put limits on things, next time somebody's going to create something crisper and drop something worse than COVID. But nobody thinks about freedom of access or freedom of speech or freedom of whatever in society. Societies have to be organized. When you organize a society, it's got to have limits. It's got to have rules. Donald Trump violated one of those rules. In fact, in a major way, he violated the rule. And it wasn't just by some rabble people out on the street, it's by the person at the top who has the power to organize something like this. The adults have to be the adults. Like it or not, your Congress and your president and your branches of government actually run the country. That's what they're supposed to do. That's their job, to run the country. Like it or not, it's their job to balance all the wants and wishes of 330 million people. That's what they're supposed to do. Watch chaos ensue if they're not there. People think that because in your world, in your little area, you can self-govern. In 1968, I do believe, when the Montreal police all went on strike at one time, they learned that people cannot self-govern in masses of people like this. They don't self-govern. You have this many people in one place, you got to have rules in place, rules of the road, and people to enforce the rules. It is what it is. You live in a semi-ordered society by design. You live in a very safe country, but that still gives you liberties, which is a fine balance. You're much safer in China, you're much safer in Japan, you're much safer in Korea, you're much safer in Singapore and Germany. But they have a very ordered society that doesn't give you as much liberty. The United States strikes a balance between safety and liberty. And Regardless of what we think, they actually do a pretty good job of it. I've been other places, okay? It's not like this in other places. In other places, you can't walk around carrying guns on your hip. Okay, you can't. It doesn't work that way. On purpose, they limit that. A lot of us are gonna have to take politics and how countries are ordered seriously. A lot of changes are actually in our hands. We just don't want to take responsibility for it. All I'm saying is basically grow up, people. You're gonna have to grow up because what's coming is gonna make you grow up. You really don't have a choice. So start learning, start making your choices before you have to make them, before they're forced upon you. Stop crying for this knucklehead. He knew what he was doing. He thought it was funny. He thought he was doing something. And those kind of people are dangerous. They are. And people don't realize how dangerous people are, dangerous situations are until it's too late. You can believe that it's fake, that it's staged, that it's not real, all that stuff until it's too late. Just like COVID-19. Believe that it was fake, believe that it was not real until people start getting sick and dying from it. Until it wrecked your economy. Anyway, let me stop fussing. This stuff is real. The Germans see it. That's why I read this thing from a German paper. They live this. They live this every day. They got to go through this all the time. It's new to us because, like I said, we're like kids that never had a bad day. And that bad day almost turned into a nightmare. We're lucky. Next time, we won't be so lucky. And trust and believe there's going to be a crackdown coming. It is. Get ready for it. I always say people get the government that they deserve. You didn't value your freedom or your right of free speech enough to protect it. Okay? Now they're going to start limiting it severely. It is what it is. But with that, I'm going to jump off here. This is BGS out, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Peace.